Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Complex Sin MA channel. Please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the short film Tauntaun Drama Pendic. The screen flickers to life, immediately plunging us into a world thick with the haze of unmet ambition. We follow a young man, clearly talented, perhaps a budding musician or artist, whose initial enthusiasm is slowly being eroded by the relentless grind of trying to make a mark in a saturated creative scene. He struggles with the pressure, the familiar ache of watching others perhaps find easier success, a dynamic that echoes the early struggles of many great performers who had to cut their teeth in dimly lit, indifferent venues. His counterpart, a woman perhaps involved in the same creative ecosystem, maybe a struggling actress or a writer whose scripts gather dust, shares a similar burden of self-doubt, masked by a veneer of professional composure. Her own journey often feels like a constant negotiation between artistic integrity and the need to simply pay rent, a trade-off that chips away at the soul. One can sense the influence of classic independent cinema on her choices, a nod to those raw, honest portrayals of urban loneliness. Their paths inevitably cross, perhaps at a shared workspace or an open mic night, where the air is thick with cheap coffee and big dreams. The connection isn't immediate fireworks. It's a gradual recognition of shared weariness, a mutual understanding of the invisible lines drawn between the successful and the trying. It's in these quiet moments, sharing observations about the industry's capriciousness, that their bond deepens. As their relationship develops, it becomes the central anchor against the turbulence of their individual careers. There's a scene highly reminiscent of that pivotal breakthrough moment in many biographical dramas, where one of them finally gets a small win, a gallery showing, a callback for a major role. But instead of pure elation, there's a strange melancholy. Success, when it arrives piecemeal, often highlights everything that hasn't quite clicked yet. This moment reveals a core tension. Can their relationship sustain the individual gravitational pulls of their careers if one begins to ascend faster than the other? The short film beautifully captures the mundane yet critical moments. Late-night arguments fueled by exhaustion, the shared triumph of finishing a difficult project, and the quiet evenings spent simply existing together, finding solace away from the demanding spotlight. One sequence where they revisit a place from their past, maybe a park bench where they first confessed their hopes, underscores the theme of grounding oneself amidst chaos. The climax isn't a grand explosion, but a subtle realignment. Perhaps one has to make a significant sacrifice, turning down a life-changing offer that requires relocation, or conversely, accepting a role that demands complete dedication, potentially putting the relationship on hold. It speaks to the inherent difficulty of sustaining intimacy when one's primary devotion must, for a time, be to the craft itself, echoing the personal costs often borne by those inspired by figures who sacrificed everything for their art. Ultimately, the narrative concludes not with a neat bow, but with a sense of earned ambiguity. They haven't conquered the industry, nor have they faded into obscurity. They have instead found a sustainable rhythm within the ongoing struggle, acknowledging that the art and the relationship is a continuous, messy project, much like the best independent films that inspire them. The final image suggests resilience, the quiet strength required to keep showing up tomorrow. The haze surrounding the young man seemed to be woven from the smoke of countless cigarettes, smoked while staring at blank pages or silent fretboards. He possessed an almost classical dedication to his chosen form, perhaps channeling the disciplined intensity one associates with early jazz innovators who practiced relentlessly in cramped basements. His frustration wasn't just about recognition, it was about authenticity, the gnawing fear that compromise would eventually dull the sharp edge of his unique voice. He often found himself scrolling through social media feeds, a modern equivalent of gazing at unattainable mansions, watching peers who seem to stumble into success through sheer luck or better self-promotion. The woman, meanwhile, carried the weight of dramatic history on her shoulders. Her aspirations likely drew from the raw emotional landscape painted by actresses known for their unflinching portrayals of complex female lives. She had a habit, visible during tense moments, of unconsciously smoothing down imaginary wrinkles in her clothing, a small gesture of trying to impose order on internal chaos. Her rejections were not just professional setbacks, they felt like personal judgments on her very essence. One might imagine her studying the screen tests of celebrated method actors, trying to decipher the secret to truly inhabiting a role without losing oneself entirely in the process. When they finally found refuge in each other's company, it wasn't a Hollywood meeting. It was the shared silence of two marathon runners, resting side by side, recognizing the mutual burning in their legs. Their conversations were often about the why they chose this punishing path, rather than the what of their daily failures. There was a tangible sense of relief in being truly seen, away from the harsh judgment of casting directors or critics. This mutual witnessing became their unofficial studio, their sanctuary where vulnerability wasn't a liability, but the very raw material they both worked with. The small victories, when they arrived, were complicated. When the man finally secured a small but significant commission for a piece of music, perhaps for an independent short film, with a respected director whose work he admired, the elation was tempered by the knowledge that the woman was facing a crushing series of auditions for roles she felt utterly unsuited for. This imbalance created subtle friction, an unspoken question. If one of us finds solid ground, do we have to build a bridge across the chasm? Or will the current pull us in opposite directions? Their moments of tenderness often involved one actively encouraging the other, forcing them back to the drawing board or the script, reminding them of the fire they first shared. The film excels in showing the intimacy born of shared hardship. There's a beautifully shot scene where they attempt to cook a complicated meal together, a metaphor for their shared attempt to construct a life from disparate, sometimes spoiled ingredients. Mistakes are made. The sauce burns, the timing is off, but they laugh. The sound genuine and unforced. These moments suggest that their relationship isn't a distraction from their careers, but perhaps the only sustainable context in which those careers can continue. They are each other's most honest editor and most forgiving audience. The narrative's turning point often involves a choice that forces a prioritization. Perhaps the woman is offered a prestigious, yet demanding theater residency abroad. The gravity of the opportunity clashes directly with the comfortable, fragile ecosystem they have built. The discussion isn't filled with accusations, but with the quiet, heavy sound of unpacking possibilities, the potential for future regret versus the certainty of present loss. It is the adult realization that passion projects often demand an almost monastic level of commitment, one that leaves little room for shared domesticity. The final impression left by their evolving dynamic is one of acceptance, that love in this demanding environment might not look like the fairy tale ending, but rather like two artists standing together, still facing the difficult dawn, equipped only with the shared knowledge that they wouldn't rather face it with anyone else. The young man's dedication bordered on the ascetic. One could picture him having idolized those jazz legends who famously lived on cigarettes and sheer musical obsession. His instrument, whether physical or metaphorical, felt less like a tool and more like an extension of a demanding inner voice. His struggle manifested in a subtle physical tension, a slight hunch in his shoulders, as if perpetually bracing against a cold wind, a posture often adopted by those who spend too much time isolated in their own creative echo chambers. He yearned not just for success, but for the validation that would silence the internal critic who whispered that his work was derivative or, worse, irrelevant. His heroes were those composers who stubbornly refused to simplify their complexities for mass appeal, and he constantly measured his output against that impossibly high, uncompromising standard. The woman's internal landscape was as intricate as the monologues she longed to perform. Her early influences might have included actresses who famously transformed themselves for roles, suggesting she sought depth over immediate fame. She possessed a quiet intensity, a gaze that seemed to measure the sincerity of everyone she encountered. When she dressed for an audition, it wasn't vanity, it was armor, a deliberate crafting of a temporary persona designed to convince skeptical gatekeepers. Her despair wasn't loud, it was the slow seepage of hope, visible only in the moments she believed she was unobserved, perhaps staring blankly at a subway map, wondering if all roads truly led back to disappointment. Their bond thrived in the negative space around their work, in the hours between the last failed callback and the first tentative morning light. This wasn't a romance born of shared leisure, it was a shared vigil. Their connection was characterized by the language of the frustrated creative, coded references to obscure influences, the shared sigh over a poorly written industry memo, and the mutual understanding of what it felt like to pour one's soul into something that would likely be shelved without a second thought. They became each other's necessary editor, the only person whose critique they truly trusted, because they knew it stemmed from a place of shared sacrifice, not envy. The film's true emotional resonance emerged when their careers diverged slightly. Say the man's music began to be used in high-profile advertising spots, a compromise that brought financial relief, but felt artistically hollow to his core. This success became a barrier. She would watch him manage these commercial projects with a mixture of pride and sadness, recognizing that he was building a comfortable cage. Conversely, if she landed a critically acclaimed but poorly paid stage role, her exhaustion became palpable, and his financial cushion felt like an insulating layer that prevented him from truly feeling the pinch of her struggle. This subtle divergence tested the core belief that they were facing the same battle. Perhaps they were merely fighting on different fronts, requiring different forms of support. One powerful sequence involved them revisiting a rundown studio space where they had once shared a desperate, hopeful late-night session. Now, returning years later, the space seemed smaller, the past ambition almost comical, against the reality of their adult compromises. It was here they acknowledged the silent agreement they had made, that the relationship existed as a temporary scaffolding, supporting two very ambitious, very fragile structures. The emotional climax wasn't about breaking up, but about redefining what together meant when the demands of their respective crafts became absolute. It suggested that true partnership in these high-stakes creative fields required periods of intense, almost painful self-focus. The resolution, fittingly, felt like the final chord of an improvised piece, unpredictable but resolved for the moment. They didn't abandon their ambitions, nor did they settle into predictable domesticity. Instead, they carved out moments of genuine, unhurried presence, treating those shared hours with the same meticulous care they applied to their art. The final scene might show them packing for separate obligations, a tour, a film shoot, but the parting is marked not by anxiety, but by a quiet, mutual affirmation. They had learned that their love was not the destination, but the essential fuel, constantly replenished by the shared recognition of the difficult, necessary path they both walked. The subsequent chapter in their intertwined narrative focused heavily on the theme of memory versus momentum, examining how the foundation they built together could either propel them forward or become an anchor weighing them down. As the man continued to navigate the commercial aspects of his musical career, perhaps scoring an episode for a popular streaming series, he became keenly aware of how his schedule dictated their interactions. The spontaneity that had initially defined their courtship evaporated, replaced by the rigid structure of production deadlines. He started noticing that the woman, in her relentless pursuit of that one career-defining theatrical role, had begun to draw inspiration from their past hardships, almost weaponizing their shared vulnerabilities in her performances. It was a troubling realization. Had their intimacy become merely research material? The woman, deeply immersed in a role that demanded emotional extremes, found herself struggling to switch off the intensity required by her craft. She channeled the disciplined focus of stage veterans who treated every performance as a potential last chance to leave a legacy. Her internal dialogue, once shared with him, was now reserved for the character she inhabited. This distance manifested physically. They began sleeping in separate rooms on occasion, not out of anger, but because her sleep was often punctuated by rehearsals or script memorization, disrupting his own fragile equilibrium earned through long studio hours. The shared evening ritual of reviewing the day transformed into two separate monologues, delivered across a dinner table, each showcasing their separate triumphs and defeats, neither truly landing because the listener was already preparing their own response. There came a poignant moment when the man, having saved enough from his commercial work, suggested they take a planned, much-needed vacation, a complete break from the city, the industry, and the struggle. This proposal, intended as an act of love and reconnection, was met with hesitation. The woman saw the time away not as rest, but as lost opportunity, a gap in her resume that a competitor might exploit. Her reaction echoed the sentiment of certain driven writers who believe that any moment not spent creating is a moment wasted, a fear of losing the hard-won momentum. This clash brought their differing approaches to success into sharp relief. He sought to build a sustainable life around the art, while she seemed to believe the art was the entire life, demanding total devotion. The film then shifts focus to external validation, showing how their differing levels of exposure begin to affect how the world perceives them as a unit. When the man is recognized at an industry event, his gratitude often includes a public, slightly generic nod to his supportive partner. However, when the woman achieves a breakthrough, perhaps receiving glowing reviews for a performance praised for its raw, almost uncomfortable truthfulness, the accolades are focused solely on her singular brilliance. In these moments, the imbalance felt most acute. He was thrilled, yet acutely aware that his support structure was largely invisible, while her visibility threatened to overshadow their shared past. It's the familiar, painful dynamic of artistic partnership, where one partner gains a public platform faster than the other, testing the sincerity of their mutual commitment against the allure of individual stardom. The narrative doesn't judge this divergence, but merely observes the immense internal pressure it places on the phrase we when the world insists on talking about her or him. The narrative deepened as the subtle strains of fame and creative divergence began to exert visible pressure on their shared space. The man, now often found immersed in sound mixing sessions that stretched into pre-dawn hours, started manifesting the slight arrogance that sometimes accompanies reliable paychecks in creative fields. He developed a habit of offering unsolicited, practical advice to the woman about her career choices, suggestions rooted in the stable, if creatively compromising, world he was now inhabiting. It was the kind of patronizing encouragement often given by those who have found a path to solvency to those still wrestling in the artistic wilderness, a shift that stung her pride, particularly given her deep respect for uncompromised artistic process. The woman, fueled by the intoxicating yet depleting energy of critical acclaim, became more reclusive. Her process seemed to demand an almost religious isolation. She carried herself with the weary nobility of a stage tragedian, someone who has seen too much darkness to easily return to daylight pleasantries. One detail that stood out was her meticulous archiving of every positive review, treating them not as celebrations, but as necessary historical documents proving her right to continue her exacting work. This collection contrasted sharply with the man's habit of deleting old demo recordings, seeing them as obsolete stepping stones rather than cherished memories. Their difference in handling legacy became a metaphor for their entire relationship. He was eager to move forward. She was desperate to anchor herself in her earned accomplishments. The vacation proposal, fraught with misunderstanding, ultimately illuminated a deeper rift than mere scheduling conflicts. When the man tentatively suggested they revisit the small city, where he'd first gained notice for a minor composition, the woman paused. She recalled that time not with nostalgia for shared intimacy, but with the sharp memory of the crippling anxiety that preceded the performance. For her, revisiting that place meant reliving the fear, whereas for him, it represented the purest form of their original aspiration. This inability to share a single emotional framework for their history signaled that the scaffolding might be collapsing under uneven weight distribution. The public recognition imbalance became a quiet, internal war. When the woman was featured in a major profile piece, the writer focused extensively on her solitary genius, barely mentioning the supportive ecosystem she relied upon. The man read the article with a hollow feeling, recognizing the narrative trope, the lone, suffering female artist, that inherently erases the stabilizing force of partnership. He saw how the industry preferred clean, singular narratives over messy, codependent truths. His quiet resilience in the background, ensuring the domestic and financial stability that allowed her to pursue that dangerous truth, remained unseen, unmarketable. The climax of this emotional arc arrived not in a fight, but in a moment of profound shared silence during a seemingly ordinary dinner. The man began discussing a potential long-term contract that would require him to relocate temporarily to a different continent to oversee a major project. He presented it as a final definitive step towards security. The woman listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, expecting shared excitement or negotiation, she simply offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the nod of acceptance that acknowledged the end of their current configuration. In that moment, they both understood that his pursuit of stability and her pursuit of uncompromised artistic apotheosis required separate geographies and separate gravitational fields. They had reached the natural terminus of a relationship where two intensely focused careers could no longer orbit the same center point without collision or casualty. The unspoken agreement was to let go gently, honoring the vital role each played in the other's journey, even as the journey diverged completely. The aftermath of that silent dinner conversation settled over them like an unexpected heavy winter frost. There was no dramatic exodus, no smashing of possessions. Rather, the dismantling was meticulous, almost reverent, mirroring the careful construction of their shared life. The man began the meticulous process of digitizing his substantial music library, preparing for the move, a task that felt strangely like preparing an archive of a life he was about to put on pause. He found himself listening to his older, less commercially polished works, the ones she had first loved, and recognizing in the raw dissonance a purity he feared he had traded for solvency. He saw his career as a steady upward trajectory, perhaps influenced by the pragmatic successes of composers who had learned to score both concert halls and advertising campaigns effectively. The woman, conversely, seemed to gain an almost terrifying clarity in the face of impending solitude. She rejected any immediate offers that required travel, doubling down on her commitment to the local theater scene, clinging to the known battlegrounds where her credibility was already established. Her artistic discipline intensified. She started waking before dawn, using the quiet hours when he was already engaged with his international calls to delve into the most psychologically taxing material. It suggested a deep-seated fear that if she allowed any softness or external reliance into her life, the intense focus required for her craft, the very focus that brought her acclaim, would dissipate, leaving her with nothing but the ordinary self she worked so hard to transcend on stage. A particularly affecting sequence captured them attempting to divide their shared belongings. It wasn't about the physical items, the worn sofa or the collection of obscure vinyl, but about assigning ownership to shared memories. When they came across a collection of ticket stubs from films they had seen in their earliest days, moments before the pressures mounted, the woman suggested keeping them together, unable to compartmentalize that shared past. The man agreed, but with a subtle hesitation, perhaps feeling that dwelling on the past would only impede his necessary forward motion. This inability to cleanly sever the memory proved that while their physical paths were splitting, the emotional overlap was profound and indelible. The film masterfully illustrates that genuine heartbreak in creative partnerships often isn't about betrayal, but about diverging definitions of fulfillment. As the man prepares for his departure, he tries one last time to articulate the security he offers, perhaps saying something like, "When you finish this run, you can come. We can build something stable." But the woman's response is revealing. She looks at him not with rejection, but with pity for his need for external stability. For her, the stability is the next role, the next challenging interpretation. She embodies the archetype of the artist who requires an element of perpetual precariousness to fuel her best work. A concept perhaps inspired by those great actors who deliberately avoided comfort to maintain their edge. The final scenes are quiet, yet devastatingly clear. There are no tearful embraces at the airport. Instead, there is a brief, purposeful meeting at a neutral location, a park bench they hadn't visited before. They exchange a small, symbolic item. He gives her a recording device loaded with ambient sounds he captured on his travels, offering her textures for future inspiration. She gives him a handwritten note containing a single, complex line of dialogue from a play she cherishes, a reminder of the power of precisely chosen words. They acknowledge that their relationship was not a failure, but a perfect, necessary crucible for the people they both needed to become to pursue their highest artistic visions. They walk away from each other not into separate futures, but into two distinct, fully realized solos, forever bound by the harmony they once created. The parting at the park bench, devoid of melodrama, resonated with the quiet finality often found in the endings of poignant biographies. The moment when the subject must step onto the road alone, having absorbed all the necessary lessons from their companions. The man, now truly embracing the global nature of contemporary music production, found a strange solace in the enforced clarity of his solitude. He began channeling his residual melancholy not into writing more introspective pieces, but into complex sonic architecture, building soundscapes that were technically brilliant, but emotionally distant, much like the architecture of a massive, impersonal corporate headquarters he might now be scoring. His discipline was no longer fueled by the need to impress his partner, but by the professional obligation to deliver flawless, marketable excellence across time zones. He was becoming exactly the kind of successful artist he once viewed with mild disdain, highly skilled, reliably employed, and perhaps slightly less hungry for raw truth. The woman, remaining rooted in the familiar city, leaned into the void, left by his departure, by embracing roles of increasing emotional gravity. She sought out characters whose central conflict was abandonment or existential isolation, allowing her to pour the actual contours of her recent separation into her work without conscious effort. This led to a surge in critical praise. Reviewers lauded her unflinching commitment to internal desolation, failing to see that the desolation was professionally managed, a direct byproduct of a relationship that had ended through mutual, non-combative necessity. Her performance style, once striving for authenticity, now bordered on the self-immolating, relying heavily on the emotional residue of her recent past, an echo of those legendary performers who blurred the lines between self and stage persona to devastating effect. Their continued infrequent communication was perhaps the most telling aspect of their separation. It wasn't avoidance. It was a careful monitoring of each other's upward trajectory tinged with a competitive tenderness. He would receive an email from her, a brief note attached to a link of a stellar review, and he would respond, not with emotional feedback, but with a highly technical comment on the lighting in the accompanying production photo, a way of engaging with her success on his own terms, through the lens of craft. She, in turn, would receive his updates on international project milestones and respond by mailing him a single, perfectly pressed dried flower, an artifact of a grounded, slow reality he no longer inhabited, a quiet suggestion that he remember what stillness felt like. The film skillfully utilized montage to illustrate their parallel existences. One sequence juxtaposed the man in a sterile, state-of-the-art mixing studio, bathed in the cool glow of digital screens, against the woman backstage in a dusty theater dressing room, applying heavy, traditional makeup by the stark light of exposed bulbs. Both were achieving a form of mastery, yet their environments suggested fundamentally different philosophies of art, one embracing the future of immaculate production, the other honoring the imperfect, immediate tradition of live performance. This visual dichotomy underscored the final truth. They had served as necessary catalysts for each other's evolution, pushing the other to the absolute limits of their respective artistic definitions, but their paths could no longer converge without one sacrificing the very ambition the other had helped ignite. The narrative concluded not with a reunion, but with a moment of poignant understanding many months later. Perhaps they happened to be in the same city for entirely separate, high-profile engagements. They might see each other across a crowded premiere lobby. Two recognizable figures who had both achieved a significant measure of the success they once dreamed of in that dingy apartment. There is a brief acknowledgement, a nod that encompasses years of shared struggle, unspoken support, and the painful clarity of their divergence. It is a nod that says, "We made it, but not together." The final image lingers on their separate movements toward their respective entrances. He into the VIP section catering to the commerce of art, she toward the stage door reserved for the performance itself. Two distinct monuments built on the shared, foundational tremor of their early desperate connection. The final encounter in the crowded lobby served as a silent, definitive summation of their divergent philosophies. The man, now moving with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being recognized but not scrutinized, carried an air of polished efficiency. His tailored clothing spoke of the serious money that now flowed from his compositions, reflecting an adherence to professionalism that mirrored the smooth, layered tracks he produced. He navigated the event with the assuredness of a producer meeting investors, his energy directed outward toward the transactional elements of his success. He had perfected the art of being present without being emotionally exposed, a defense mechanism honed by years of dealing with high-stakes corporate clients who valued reliability above all else. The woman, standing near the entrance to the performance space, still carried a trace of that raw, almost bruised intensity, even beneath the sheen of her hard-won acclaim. Her elegance felt less like acquisition and more like endurance. She was the living embodiment of a difficult text bravely delivered. She noticed him, and for a fleeting second, the professional mask slipped, revealing the girl who once shared instant noodles with him, terrified of missing an audition. This fleeting recognition, however, was immediately subsumed by the gravity of the evening ahead. The knowledge that on stage, she would have to conjure vulnerability that felt increasingly foreign in her day-to-day life. Her reliance on intense, deeply felt emotion for her craft meant that stability, the very thing he had achieved, felt like a creative sedative she dared not take. Their shared nod, spanning the chasm between their current realities, was more complex than simple recognition. It was an acknowledgement of the pact they had unwittingly made, that for one to fully realize the potential for expansive, global influence, and for the other to achieve the deep, singular artistic resonance she craved, they had to operate on different frequencies. The man saw in her the necessary, beautiful sacrifice he had consciously avoided, and she saw in him the viable, pragmatic path she couldn't bring herself to walk. There was no resentment, only the profound sadness that the intensity required to achieve singular greatness inevitably burns bridges to shared comfort. As they finally turned away from each other, he toward the illuminated reception where networking was the primary art form, she toward the muted shadows leading to the stage. The film captured the quiet triumph of two individuals who managed to survive their own ambition. They hadn't compromised their core artistic identities. Rather, the relationship had served its ultimate function, to provide the necessary friction and ballast that allowed each to calibrate precisely toward their destined poles. The man walked towards the future of digitized sound and global contracts, ready to build his empire, while the woman moved toward the spotlight, prepared to momentarily dissolve into the essential truth of her role. Their love story was not a failure of connection, but rather the ultimate success of two distinct creative destinies, briefly, beautifully aligned before continuing their necessary, separate trajectories across the vast landscape of artistic pursuit. The subsequent moments crystallized the inherent loneliness that often accompanies the final arrival at one's ambition. The man, moving through the reception, felt a distinct disconnect between the accolades he received and the genuine human connection he craved. He was lauded for his innovative scoring work on several prestige projects, yet the conversations revolved around market share, licensing agreements, and future collaborations. Sterile exchanges devoid of the passionate debates about harmonic structure they used to have late at night. He noticed how easily he slipped into the language of commerce, a fluency that felt both powerful and profoundly alienating. It mirrored the career trajectory of certain composers who successfully transitioned from underground scenes to high-budget film work, gaining undeniable financial security at the cost of the raw, untamed spirit that initially defined their sound. He found himself momentarily wishing for the chaotic energy of their shared, cramped apartment, where a burnt piece of toast could spark an hour-long argument about aesthetics. Meanwhile, the woman stepped onto the stage, and the transformation was absolute. The stage lights, unforgiving and absolute, seemed to strip away the polished veneer of her recent success. In the initial moments of the performance, she appeared physically fragile, almost overwhelmed by the weight of expectation. However, as the narrative of the play demanded dissent, she dove into the role with an almost frightening abandon. It was as if the emotional vacuum left by the man's departure had been instantly filled by the needs of the character. She wasn't merely acting, she was metabolizing the real-world loss into theatrical voltage. This act of channeling personal emptiness into public catharsis was intoxicating for the audience, who saw only the art, not the sacrifice. She was experiencing the paradoxical fulfillment known by artists who find their truest selves only when inhabiting the skin of another, often suffering soul. The shared memory, reduced to that brief, wordless exchange in the lobby, became a constant, unseen undercurrent. Weeks later, the man found himself unexpectedly composing a brief, melancholic piano piece while awaiting a flight in a sterile airport lounge. It was structurally simple, lacking the complex layering of his commercial work, and contained a distinct harmonic dissonance that felt unsettlingly familiar. He recognized it immediately as a musical reflection of her, a piece he would have played for her years ago, not for pay, but for an audience of one. He didn't record it. Instead, he deliberately let the memory of the melody fade as the boarding call was announced, an active choice to safeguard his current momentum over indulging in productive nostalgia. He understood that revisiting that pure, shared origin point was no longer sustainable for the person he had become. For the woman, the play concluded its critically successful run. In the quiet solitude of her empty dressing room, surrounded by the discarded remnants of her costume and the glowing newspaper clippings, the feeling was not triumph, but exhaustion. She picked up the handwritten note he had given her, the single line of dialogue, and realized its power lay not in its dramatic potential, but in its intimacy. It was a token of deep understanding, a secret language they no longer needed to speak. She understood then that their love had been the ultimate workshop, forging them into the artists capable of standing alone. The film concludes with her looking out the window at the distant, glittering skyline, knowing that somewhere within that vast architecture of modern success, he was building his world, and she, having mined the depths of her past pain, was ready to build the next stage of hers. Two separate, complete artistic statements launched from the same volatile launchpad. The aftermath of their public acknowledgement settled into a sustained silence, a mutual respect for the closed chapter. For the man, the geographical separation translated into an intensified focus on scale and scope. He began embracing projects that demanded a meticulous, almost obsessive control over the sonic environment, scoring vast, dystopian science fiction narratives, where emotionality was often delivered via synthesized texture rather than traditional melody. This work required an emotional detachment that ironically echoed his personal state. He was engineering feeling for others while maintaining a safe, insulated distance from his own. He became recognized for his ability to construct worlds purely through sound, a mastery that perhaps stemmed from the earlier necessity of building an entire emotional world for himself when his partner was preoccupied with her own intense creative demands. His dedication now was to the craft as a system, precise and repeatable, rather than a volatile expression of personal truth. The woman, conversely, found that the absence of his grounded presence forced her deeper into the exploration of internal landscapes. She deliberately chose projects that were sparse, focused heavily on dialogue and intimate psychological tension, often rejecting larger ensemble pieces that might distract from her singular focus. She discovered a new level of vocal control, a quiet intensity that could convey volumes with the barest inflection, a technique perfected by actors who learn to command attention without relying on grand gestures, a necessity when one's primary audience is a critical few in a small theater rather than a stadium. Her apartment, once shared chaos, transformed into a monastic space dedicated to rehearsal and reading, a physical manifestation of her need to guard her limited reserves of personal energy strictly for the work. She understood that the very stability he represented could inadvertently dampen the necessary creative friction she required. Their parallel professional existences sometimes intersected in the abstract realm of industry gossip or veiled professional references. When the man won a major industry award for a score that employed vast, complex orchestral arrangements, he delivered a gracious speech acknowledging the necessity of solitude in creation. The woman, watching the broadcast alone, interpreted this not as a slight, but as confirmation of the artistic gap that had opened between them. His solitude was now productive and celebrated, whereas hers had once been viewed as self-indulgent. She reflected that his success was built on projection outward, while hers was built on excavation inward, two valid, yet fundamentally incompatible methods of extracting meaning. The film subtly addressed the question of legacy and romantic myth-making. There were moments where the woman, perhaps speaking to a young, aspiring actor during a workshop, would recount brief anecdotes of their shared struggles, the eviction scares, the shared triumphant midnight rehearsal. But she would edit the story, removing the context of their eventual parting. She preserved the myth of shared hardship as inspiration, consciously sanitizing the narrative to present their relationship as a purely constructive force, an ideal crucible that yielded success, rather than a complex, deeply felt bond that ultimately could not survive the forces it helped unleash. The narrative's final contemplation focused not on regret, but on integration. Years later, both are firmly established titans in their respective fields, symbols of artistic dedication realized. They might cross paths again, perhaps at an entirely different function, years apart. This time, the encounter is shorter, cleaner. There's a shared, fleeting recognition of the immense distance traveled, the specific hardships overcome, and the price paid. The final, lingering shot might focus on an object one of them holds, Perhaps the man is checking a complex digital sequencer on his customized phone, a symbol of his global reach. Perhaps the woman clutches a worn paperback script, pages filled with her own frantic notes. They are living proof that sometimes the purest form of love between two fiercely driven individuals is the recognition that they must separate completely in order to fully become the artists they were meant to be, leaving behind a shared history that functions less as a memory and more as the invisible, stabilizing foundation of their individual masterpieces. The cinematic output labeled Tauntaun Drama Pendek, while seemingly a collection of brief dramatic sketches, offers a surprisingly rich tapestry for analysis, particularly when viewed through the lens of contemporary Malaysian short-form digital storytelling. These pieces, often produced for online streaming platforms, embody a fascinating tension between the demands of rapid content consumption and the enduring need for resonant human drama. The very format, the pendek or short, forces a conciseness that often elevates specific performances or thematic declarations above sprawling narrative development. Examining the common threads woven through several examples within this category reveals a preoccupation with relatable, domestic realism. The settings are frequently cramped apartments, bustling market stalls, or familiar suburban landscapes, grounding the often heightened emotional stakes in a recognizable reality for the target audience. This contrasts sharply with the polished, almost hyper-real aesthetic often favored by international streaming giants. Here, the grit feels authentic, serving the narrative rather than overwhelming it. The acting talent frequently showcased in these shorts provides a key area for critical engagement. Many actors involved are veterans of Malaysian television serials, accustomed to the grueling pace of daily drama production. This background imparts a specific kind of lived-in proficiency to their performances. They can convey complex emotional arcs, grief, burgeoning romance, betrayal, with an economy of expression honed over years in the high-volume drama mill. For instance, the subtlety displayed by an actor transitioning from a decades-long career in romantic comedies to a role demanding quiet desperation in a Tauntaun Pendek short speaks volumes about their range, often revealed more effectively in these constrained formats than in multi-episode sagas. Their ability to pivot from broad comedy to nuanced tragedy within a 10-minute frame is itself a testament to the demanding training ground the regional television industry provides. Thematic inspiration often appears drawn from societal pressures facing the younger Malaysian demographic. Issues of financial strain, the complexities of intercultural relationships within a multiracial society, and the search for authentic identity outside parental expectations frequently surface. These themes are not explored through elaborate political allegory, but through direct, often painfully personal confrontations. One might observe a recurring motif where a character attempts to reconcile traditional obligations with modern aspirations, a conflict deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of the region. The digital platform itself acts as an amplifier, ensuring these specific anxieties reach the demographic living them directly, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of cinema distribution. Furthermore, the directorial approaches, though varied, often lean toward kinetic energy. Quick cuts, handheld camera work, and close-ups dominate, mimicking the pacing of social media feeds. This visual language is clearly influenced by global digital trends, suggesting that the creators are keenly aware of how their audience consumes content across multiple screens simultaneously. The inspiration here is less likely drawn from classic cinematic auteurs and more from the successful viral video formats that prioritize immediate emotional hook. This adaptation is crucial. It signals the platform's understanding that brevity requires maximum impact per second. In essence, Tauntaun Drama Pendek functions as a vital, albeit sometimes raw, incubator for Malaysian dramatic talent and thematic exploration. It serves as a low-stakes testing ground, where established actors can stretch their boundaries and emerging storytellers can rapidly deploy high-impact narratives. The success of these shorts is measured not by box office returns, but by engagement metrics. Yet they achieve genuine dramatic resonance by focusing intensely on universal human experiences filtered through a distinctly local and immediately accessible lens. They reflect a dynamic media environment where content must be immediate, emotionally honest, and perfectly calibrated for the device in the viewer's hand. The emotional landscape of these short dramas is characterized by an intensity born of necessity. Because the runtime is so restricted, the writers often jettison the slow build of exposition, plunging the viewer directly into the crisis point. Consider the character archetype frequently encountered: the young professional juggling multiple part-time jobs, their face etched with fatigue not merely from overwork, but from the crushing weight of familial expectation placed upon them. This is not abstract struggle. It is rendered visible in the way the actor holds their shoulders, a slight, permanent slump, or in the hurried, almost apologetic manner they consume their meals, often while scrolling through job listings on a cheaply illuminated phone screen. This physical manifestation of anxiety is a signature of the genre, demanding an immediate empathetic connection from the audience who recognize that exhaustion in their own lives. In scenes involving romantic conflict, the dialogue rarely meanders toward elaborate justifications. Instead, the short format demands an eruption. A betrayal is revealed not through a drawn-out confrontation spanning several scenes, but through a single devastating line delivered across a small kitchen table, illuminated harshly by overhead lighting that leaves no shadows for obfuscation. The camera work, often favoring extreme close-ups during these moments, captures the minute twitch of an eyelid, the subtle tremor in the lower lip, the micro-expressions that seasoned television actors master to communicate volumes in a fraction of a second. These performances are often deeply rooted in the cultural understanding of politeness, masking deep-seated resentment. The explosion is shocking precisely because the preceding facade of decorum was so rigorously maintained. The influence of specific directors or writers, though often obscured by the platform's branding, can be discerned in recurring stylistic tics. Some episodes betray the influence of directors who cut their teeth in the world of high-end advertising, resulting in sleek but emotionally hollow visuals that prioritize sheen over soul. Conversely, others exhibit a clear inspiration from independent cinema traditions, utilizing long takes in mundane settings, a protracted wait at a bus stop perhaps, to allow the internal monologue of the character to bleed visibly into their external stillness. It is in these moments of deliberate quiet that the true depth of the character's isolation is felt. They are searching for connection in spaces designed for transit, mirroring the transient nature of the digital attention span itself. The scarcity of resources inherent in short-form production often forces creative solutions that inadvertently enhance the narrative realism. A sparse set, for example, becomes symbolic of the character's limited means or emotional availability. A single, slightly flickering fluorescent bulb in a cramped rented room suggests a precarious existence far more effectively than pages of descriptive script could manage. These limitations compel the performers to rely more heavily on genuine emotional recall, rather than elaborate set design to carry the emotional weight. A celebrated actress, known for her opulent roles in high-budget historical dramas, might shed all artifice here, appearing almost unvarnished, her talent for conveying vulnerability stripped bare for the digital eye. This unflinching presentation of self, especially from established figures, lends an unexpected gravitas to the often simple narratives of paying rent or mending a fractured friendship. It suggests a professional desire to remain tethered to authentic emotional expression, regardless of the scale of the production. The authenticity often achieved in these digital vignettes owes a significant debt to the casting choices, which frequently prioritize recognition and immediate emotional shorthand over star power in the traditional sense. Audiences are greeted by faces they have followed for years across various local mediums, creating an immediate, almost familial intimacy. When the character facing a crisis, perhaps a mother struggling to fund her child's essential medical treatment, is played by an actress whose previous roles involved nurturing, maternal archetypes, the dissonance between expectation and grim reality amplifies the dramatic impact. The audience projects years of prior goodwill onto this new struggle, making the stakes feel instantly personal. Furthermore, the brief nature of the narrative forces an emphasis on the reaction rather than the event. We seldom see the full mechanics of the inciting incident, the argument that leads to the breakup, the paperwork that seals the eviction, but rather the immediate, visceral aftermath. This places immense pressure on the actors portraying the moment of realization or acceptance. Imagine a scene where a young man, perhaps an aspiring musician whose entire identity hinges on his artistic pursuit, receives a final rejection email. The camera focuses not on the phone screen, but on the way his hand, resting on a cheap wooden desk, slowly clenches into a useless fist. The emotion conveyed is one of suffocated ambition, a feeling particularly potent for a generation navigating saturated creative fields. The actor, perhaps someone who has struggled for years for a break in regional theater, before finding footing in these digital shorts, channels that lived experience of constant near success into that single powerful physical gesture. The sound design, often overlooked in analyses focused purely on visuals, plays a critical, albeit subtle role in amplifying the emotional texture. In moments of high tension, ambient noise is frequently heightened. The relentless hum of an old air conditioner, the distant, indifferent sound of traffic rushing past a window, serving as a counterpoint to the character's internal turmoil. This auditory environment underscores a key thematic element: the profound loneliness experienced amidst urban density. The world moves on, indifferent to the specific tragedy unfolding in the foreground. Conversely, moments of tentative hope or reconciliation are often marked by an abrupt, almost jarring silence, forcing the audience to lean in to listen for the faint possibility of repair. These short dramas, therefore, function as concentrated emotional pressure cookers. They are the dramatic equivalent of a highly distilled essence, forcing performers to deliver peak emotional performance in condensed bursts. The inspiration, perhaps inadvertently, comes from the necessity of the medium itself. If you only have 8 minutes to make a viewer care deeply about a character's precarious situation, every glance, every sigh, and every carefully chosen prop must carry the weight of an entire feature film's worth of backstory. It is in this economical, hyper-focused storytelling that Tantan Dramapendic finds its unexpected yet enduring dramatic resonance. The relationship between these short-form productions and the broader regional film industry merits further examination, as they often serve as an unofficial, yet highly effective, proving ground for future long-form directors and writers. A narrative voice that shines brightly in the constrained environment of a 15-minute short, displaying an innate understanding of pacing, thematic clarity, and efficient character introduction, is precisely what producers seek for larger projects. We see established cinematographers, perhaps weary of the prolonged, often bureaucratic process of feature film production, gravitate toward these shorts for the sheer creative velocity. They can experiment with lighting schemes or movement patterns informed by cutting-edge international digital cinematography, yet apply those ideas within a contained narrative structure that demands immediate payoff rather than gradual unfolding. This rapid prototyping environment also allows for the exploration of stylistic risks that might be deemed too commercially precarious for a full-length theatrical release. For instance, a director might deploy highly subjective points of view, immersing the viewer entirely within a character's sensory overload, a technique that relies heavily on rapid sound mixing and visual distortion. Such sequences, if stretched across 90 minutes, might become alienating. However, deployed strategically for a single intense minute within a short drama, they become electrifying markers of psychological breakdown. The actors in these scenarios must possess an extraordinary capacity for controlled chaos, maintaining the integrity of the underlying emotional motivation even when the visual language around them dissolves into abstraction. Moreover, the creation cycle for Tantan Drama Pendik inherently fosters a more democratic creative hierarchy than traditional filmmaking. Budgets are tighter, demanding a closer, more collaborative partnership between department heads. The costume designer, working with minimal resources, might collaborate directly with the lead actor to select clothing that instantly communicates socioeconomic status and current emotional turmoil. A worn-out t-shirt that has been painstakingly chosen for its specific faded hue, or a single piece of jewelry held onto from a happier past. This necessity for seamless integration means that the final performance is not just the actor's effort, but the culmination of rapid, iterative decisions made by the entire small crew, resulting in an organic authenticity that polished, large-scale productions sometimes struggle to replicate due to excessive specialization. The result is a collection of fleeting, sharp snapshots of Malaysian life, each one demonstrating that true dramatic power resides not in spectacle, but in the unflinching, immediate portrayal of recognizable human struggle. The inherent brevity of the format also dictates a specific approach to character development, favoring depth of immediate feeling over breadth of biography. Characters are often introduced mid-crisis, their entire life context implied, through a few carefully chosen artifacts or visual cues, rather than explicit dialogue. Consider the antagonist, who in traditional drama might receive extensive backstory to justify their malice. Here, the antagonist's corruption is often established through a single telling piece of stage dressing, a pristine, expensive watch contrasting sharply with a squalid room, or a refusal to meet the gaze of another character, signaling a moral cowardice that requires no elaborate explanation. The actor playing this role is tasked with embodying a fully formed moral failing instantly, a challenge that draws upon a deep reservoir of interpretative skill, honed outside the usual narrative scaffolding. This focus on instant characterization pushes the emotional delivery into the realm of the purely visceral. Where a feature film might spend 20 minutes earning the audience's tears, these shorts must provoke them within 2. This often leads to scenes involving parental figures under immense duress, perhaps facing a moment of profound disappointment in their adult children. The performance centers on the betrayal of inherited hope. The camera may linger on the hands of an older woman, perhaps a former teacher or homemaker, whose sacrifices defined her life, as she slowly puts down a meaningful object, a photograph, a letter, the gesture itself, conveying the finality of a shattered dream more powerfully than any verbal lamentation. The subtle trembling in her grip speaks volumes about a lifetime of deferred personal ambition now collapsing under the weight of reality. The inspiration for some of the more melodramatic elements can sometimes be traced back, paradoxically, to the very nature of the social media platforms where these dramas are often consumed. Certain narrative beats, the sudden revelation, the sharp reversal of fortune, mirror the structure of highly effective viral storytelling designed to stop the downward scroll. This awareness creates a peculiar feedback loop. The drama reflects the digital consumption patterns, which in turn influence the creation of the drama. A young actor, fresh from achieving minor recognition via short, emotionally charged online videos, brings an innate understanding of how to play to the algorithm, leveraging sharp, easily digestible emotional peaks that translate well into brief viewing windows. Ultimately, Tonton Drama Pendek represents an artistic negotiation with constraint. It strips away the luxury of slow exposition and relies instead on the concentrated power of experienced performance and visually efficient storytelling. These fleeting dramas are powerful precisely because they refuse to waste a single frame, forcing both creator and audience to engage with the raw emotional core of contemporary Malaysian experience with startling immediacy. They are the necessary punctuation marks in a fast-moving cultural conversation. The dialogue within these short narratives often adopts a clipped, highly pressurized rhythm, reflecting the character's need to communicate critical information before the allotted time expires. Conversations are frequently punctuated by interruptions, not necessarily out of rudeness, but because the characters are constantly multitasking or existing under external pressures that demand immediate attention. A key feature is the use of half-finished sentences or unspoken agreements, where years of shared history between two characters allow them to convey complex understandings through mere implication. For instance, two longtime friends discussing a shared secret might exchange only 3 or 4 loaded phrases, with the majority of the emotional weight resting on the pauses and the shared knowing glances, a technique perfected by veterans of quick-paced television dialogue, who must move the plot along while maintaining character authenticity. This reliance on implied context places a significant burden on the supporting cast, who often have only fleeting moments to establish their presence. Consider the neighbor or the minor coworker. These figures are sketched in with bold, immediate strokes. A landlord might appear for only 30 seconds to deliver an ultimatum, but the actor ensures that every detail, the way they adjust their ill-fitting tie, the faint scent of stale cigarettes implied by their proximity, establishes them as an unyielding force of societal pressure. These brief but impactful appearances ensure that the world surrounding the protagonist feels palpably real and actively hostile or indifferent to their plight. The portrayal of grief in these shorts often sidesteps the grand theatrical displays common in older cinema, opting instead for a more internalized, almost numb reaction. An actor portraying sudden loss might manifest it not through loud wailing, but through an unnerving stillness, perhaps standing motionless in front of an open refrigerator, illuminated by its stark, cold light, unable to process the simple necessity of choosing food. This depiction of emotional paralysis resonates strongly with the modern viewer, who often finds that significant life events cause a temporary cessation of all ordinary functions. The actor, perhaps someone whose career breakthrough came through playing characters grappling with quiet desperation, uses this stillness as a form of dramatic expression, a refusal by the body to participate in a reality that has suddenly become unbearable. The influence of regional theatrical traditions subtly surfaces in moments of heightened performance, particularly when the drama requires a full-body release of pent-up emotion, often near the conclusion. While the visuals strive for realism, there remains a controlled, almost choreographic element to these outbursts of anger or catharsis. This suggests that the performers are drawing upon a training that values disciplined physicality, ensuring that even in their most uncontrolled moments, the performance remains technically precise. It is this fusion, the raw contemporary subject matter, filtered through the disciplined technique of experienced dramatic artists, that gives the tauntaun drama pendic its unique sharp edge, making these brief narratives feel both utterly current and classically structured in their emotional arcs. The thematic exploration of ambition and its necessary sacrifices is another recurring pillar underpinning these short dramas, often focusing on the young artist or entrepreneur whose dreams are constantly colliding with mundane financial realities. The setting frequently reinforces this collision, a tiny rented studio space, doubling simultaneously as a design workshop and a kitchen, the tools of creation sharing shelf space with instant noodle packets. The protagonist, perhaps a director recently lauded for a previous, highly stylized short, is now forced to accept a soul-crushing corporate job just to maintain solvency. The tension is externalized through the visual disparity between their professional uniform, a stiff, ill-fitting suit, and the vibrant, almost rebellious color palette of the artistic projects hidden away in a drawer or under the bed. The emotional arc for these characters is typically one of delayed gratification, curdling into resentment. We observe a scene where the protagonist is forced to professionally praise a mediocre project mandated by their new employer. The actor conveys this dissonance through subtle physical tells, an almost imperceptible tightening around the jawline, or a reluctance to make direct eye contact with their superior, suggesting a private battle to maintain self-worth against the necessity of the paycheck. This internal conflict is vital, as it taps directly into the anxieties of a highly educated, yet often underemployed demographic struggling to define success on their own terms versus society's imposed metrics. The soundscape, particularly in scenes depicting the protagonist's mandated office work, shifts dramatically from the intimate, emotionally charged sound design of their private moments. The office environment is characterized by a monotonous, almost clinical sound mix. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the distant muffled sound of water cooler chatter, and the sterile hum of fluorescent lighting. This sonic sterility acts as a perfect foil to the vibrant, often passionate sound mixes of their artistic endeavors. The driving local music, the focused sound of a pen sketching rapidly. The contrast serves to underscore the emotional cost of conformity. The character is physically present in the mundane soundscape, while their emotional and creative energy remains trapped in the richer, more expressive world they are currently sacrificing. Furthermore, the character of the mentor or guide, usually a figure of wisdom in longer narratives, is often absent or actively misleading in these shorts. If a mentor appears, they are frequently depicted as either having sold out their own artistic integrity for commercial success or as being entirely incapable of providing practical advice for the current economic climate. This absence of clear guidance reinforces the sense of isolation. The protagonist must navigate ethical and financial pitfalls entirely alone, a reality that feels acutely contemporary. The resulting performance is often characterized by guarded optimism, a fragile belief in their own trajectory that masks a profound, almost paralyzing self-doubt, making their small victories, the completion of a single genuine artistic piece, despite the day job, feel monumental. The cinematography in many successful Tantan drama Pendik installments leans heavily into handheld intimacy, an aesthetic choice that blurs the line between documentary realism and staged drama. This deliberate lack of smooth, controlled framing often serves to heighten the protagonist's subjective experience of chaos. When a character is dealing with immediate, unexpected upheaval, say discovering an infidelity or receiving devastating news about a family member's health, the camera mirrors their disorientation. The slight involuntary shake of the lens becomes an extension of the character's nervous system, allowing the audience to feel the tremor of reality before the character can fully process it verbally. Actors who excel in this environment are those capable of grounding the visual instability with an intensely focused core performance. They cannot rely on perfectly composed shots to carry the emotional load. Instead, their entire being must communicate the crisis. This visual style often necessitates close collaboration with the sound mixer, particularly in outdoor or public settings. Instead of using sweeping, establishing shots, the sound design pulls the character's immediate vicinity into sharp focus while letting the surrounding environment become a washed-out, aggressive drone. Consider a scene set in a crowded hawker center, where a critical, quiet exchange must take place. The actor delivering the crucial line, perhaps confessing a secret, must project with a natural acoustic presence that cuts through the overwhelming background noise of sizzling woks and shouted orders. This technique forces the viewer to strain, mimicking the protagonist's struggle to maintain a private moment amidst the relentless pressure of public life. It is a reflection of the cultural reality where personal crises rarely occur in private, soundproofed chambers. The emotional architecture of betrayal, a frequent narrative catalyst, is often explored through the lens of economic vulnerability. The betrayal isn't always romantic. Frequently, it involves a business partner or trusted colleague exploiting a power imbalance. The betrayed character, often portrayed by an actor whose previous work focused on roles of diligent diligence and hard-earned success exhibits a specific kind of deflation. It is not anger that dominates, but a slow, sickening realization of having misjudged the essential character of another. This is often captured in a moment where the betrayed character physically retreats from the betrayer, not by running, but by deliberately increasing the physical distance between them across a small table, a subtle but definitive severing of the relationship captured in the shift of posture alone. The recurring motif of hidden shame or unspoken societal pressure ties directly into the visual choices surrounding clothing and environment. A character who outwardly projects success, perhaps a woman in a sharp, corporate blazer, will frequently be shown in tight, uncomfortable clothing that seems to restrict her breathing, or in an apartment where every surface is meticulously clean but utterly devoid of personal warmth, suggesting that her external presentation consumes all available emotional and physical energy. This visual shorthand, developed through rapid collaboration between the costume department and the director, efficiently communicates that the character's true self is being suffocated by the role they must play to survive in the contemporary urban landscape. The short form demands that every item seen carries narrative weight, transforming the mise en scène into a dense layer of silent commentary. The brevity of these dramatic sketches often mandates that character arcs conclude not with complete resolution, but with a moment of stark, unsentimental acceptance. Unlike sprawling television series designed to provide exhaustive closure, the Tauntaun Pendik frequently ends on the cusp of the next struggle. This resonates with the actual rhythm of modern life, where small victories are often immediately succeeded by new, unanticipated challenges. For the lead actor, this means their final scene cannot be a triumphant crescendo, but rather a quiet, grounded return to equilibrium, albeit a scarred one. One powerful example involves a character who has fought relentlessly against systemic injustice, perhaps challenging an unfair workplace decision. The climax is not the signing of the settlement papers, but the character sitting alone, late at night, staring at the paperwork, their face showing exhaustion rather than elation. The actor's triumph lies in conveying that the fight has depleted them, even if they have technically won the battle. This focus on the psychological aftermath of conflict often draws upon inspirations from contemporary regional literature that deals with existential malaise beneath a facade of progress. The performances reflect a cultural undercurrent where maintaining harmony or wifak is paramount, even when internalizing great distress. Thus, the most devastating moments are often marked by an unnerving quietude. A character facing career ruin might simply engage in an obsessively mundane task, like meticulously organizing a stack of papers that no longer holds any importance, their focus absolute, signaling a dissociation from the larger catastrophe. This technique relies heavily on the performer's ability to inhabit stillness, suggesting that the character has moved past the point of reactive emotion into a state of enduring, quiet endurance, a powerful dramatic statement in a medium built on speed. Furthermore, the narrative structures often employ a non-linear approach to convey memory and regret, even within their short span. A sudden sensory input, a specific scent, a familiar melody playing faintly from a distant radio, can trigger a flash of intense, unvoiced memory related to the main conflict. The actor must transition instantaneously from the present-day reality to the emotional register of the past event, often through nothing more than a subtle shift in eye focus and the momentary slackening of facial muscles. These brief temporal jumps are narrative shortcuts designed to load years of implied backstory into seconds. An actress renowned for her highly physical, almost melodramatic roles in historical epics may find this constraint liberating, allowing her to explore the sharp, immediate pain of memory with a subtlety impossible in wider productions. The overall effect of these concentrated narratives is a powerful sense of immediacy, coupled with profound social commentary. By stripping away narrative padding, Tauntaun Drama Pendic forces an unflinching view of contemporary concerns, financial precarity, identity negotiations, and the constant negotiation between personal desire and communal expectation. The brilliance lies in how the experienced cast members utilize their deep well of craft to breathe complex, flawed humanity into scripts that often offer them only fleeting opportunities. They transform brief sketches into impactful vignettes that linger, not because of spectacular events, but because of the recognizable, often unspoken, weight carried by the characters they embody. The visual composition, particularly in scenes dealing with familial duty and obligation, frequently employs framing techniques that emphasize entrapment and boundary setting. A recurring shot might feature a character framed tightly between two imposing architectural elements, a doorway and a wall, or the rigid lines of a window frame, suggesting that their choices are externally dictated and circumscribed. This framing device is particularly effective when illustrating the emotional claustrophobia experienced by younger characters, caught between the demands of tradition and the pull of modern individualism. The actor occupying this space must convey a sense of physical confinement, even in wide shots, their posture perhaps slightly hunched or leaning away from the center of the frame, subtly pushing against the invisible borders imposed by family expectation. The choice of wardrobe in these duty-bound scenarios often serves as a visual representation of this internal battle. A character might be dressed in meticulously neat, often somewhat dated clothing provided by parents or older relatives, symbolizing adherence to prescribed roles. Yet there will invariably be one small subversive element, a brightly colored modern bracelet hidden beneath a long sleeve, or a pair of trainers worn discreetly under a formal sarong. This small rebellion, instantly recognizable to the target audience, becomes the focal point for the character's hidden aspiration. The performer, often a rising talent still navigating their own career trajectory, imbues this single item with the weight of their entire unspoken desire for autonomy. Moreover, the pace of emotional decay within these short dramas is often accelerated by the use of non-diegetic music that clashes subtly with the on-screen action. In a moment meant to signify familial bonding or tentative reconciliation, a score might introduce a melancholic string section that subtly hints at underlying unresolved tensions. This preemptive emotional signaling prevents the scene from ever achieving true, simple happiness. The actors must perform with a layer of irony, their smiles perhaps too bright, their gestures slightly overdone, knowing that the music is telling the audience that this fragile piece is temporary. This manipulation of audience expectation is a sophisticated technique, borrowed from highly polished commercial production, but deployed here to serve a deeper sense of dramatic inevitability. The overall impact of Tauntaun Drama Pendic lies in its relentless commitment to capturing specific, high-stakes micro-moments of the Malaysian urban experience. It eschews the broad strokes necessary for feature films, favoring instead the sharp, almost painful focus of a photograph taken in the heat of the moment. The talent involved, those who can master the art of conveying a decade of lived struggle through a fleeting glance or a perfectly timed inhalation, are not just entertainers. They are cultural cartographers, mapping the precise pressures that define contemporary domestic and professional existence within a rapidly evolving society. The power of these shorts is cumulative. They offer short, sharp doses of recognition that, when viewed in aggregate, paint a surprisingly complete, if intensely focused, portrait of modern life. The portrayal of professional ambition, especially among younger female characters, introduces a fascinating layer of complexity, often intersecting with societal expectations of composure and deference. These characters, frequently played by actresses known for their early career successes in roles demanding extreme diligence and politeness, are often depicted navigating cutthroat corporate environments, where their competence is consistently questioned or underestimated. The visual narrative frequently shows them over-prepared. Their desks are immaculate, their notes color-coded to an obsessive degree, indicating the exhausting effort required to merely equal their male counterparts. The emotional signature of these high-achieving women is often a tightly managed form of suppressed anger. In confrontations, instead of open defiance, the actor channels frustration into an almost superhuman level of control. A moment of high tension might involve a superior making an unfounded criticism. The character does not shout back, but rather her fingers, resting on the keyboard, might curl inward until the knuckles whiten perceptibly, a silent testament to the immense physical effort required to keep her voice level and measured. This restraint is itself a form of drama, showcasing the psychological toll exacted by navigating professional spaces while adhering to unspoken codes of feminine behavior. The inspiration for these characterizations appears drawn heavily from real-life narratives, circulated within online professional communities, where the struggle for recognition often plays out in subtle, documented power plays rather than dramatic boardroom showdowns. When a character finally achieves a necessary breakthrough, perhaps securing a major client or finally receiving the long overdue promotion, the accompanying emotion is rarely pure joy. Instead, it is tinged with relief bordering on depletion. The celebratory moment might be visually represented by the character finally allowing herself to lean back in her ergonomically correct but ultimately unsatisfying office chair, closing her eyes not in victory, but in a brief, desperate moment of sensory respite before the next wave of responsibility crashes down. Furthermore, the relationship dynamics within these short narratives frequently subvert traditional romantic tropes. When romance does appear, it is often secondary to the professional struggle and, crucially, viewed through the prism of utility or distraction. A potential love interest might be introduced, but the audience quickly understands that the protagonist lacks the emotional bandwidth for a full relationship. The actress conveys this through hesitant body language when approached romantically, a quick glance away, a defensive crossing of the arms, signaling that her primary allegiance remains with her demanding professional goals. This realism, that ambition often necessitates the temporary sidelining of personal fulfillment, provides a stark, resonant counterpoint to idealized romantic narratives prevalent in mainstream media. The success of these shorts, therefore, hinges on their ability to acknowledge the real-world trade-offs inherent in striving for success in a competitive landscape, rendering the characters' sacrifices tangible and deeply felt within their compressed screen time. The persistent theme of social mobility, or the stark lack thereof, is another crucible within which these characters are tested, often resulting in performances deeply marked by the tension between aspiration and inertia. When a character makes a significant leap, perhaps moving from a cramped, shared room in the outskirts to a slightly larger yet still sparse studio closer to the city center, the visual storytelling is less about celebration and more about the anxiety of maintaining the new status. The actor portraying this upward move often emphasizes the meticulous care taken with the few possessions that made the journey. A single framed print, perhaps a print of a modernist painting or a local abstract piece, is hung with almost religious precision. Its levelness, a frantic effort to project order onto an otherwise precarious existence. The emotional landscape in these transition scenes is defined by a pervasive sense of imposter syndrome. The character knows they do not fully belong in their new environment, and this manifests physically in how they interact with space. They might avoid occupying the center of the room, preferring to stand near the doorway or edge, ready to retreat if challenged. The camera often captures this through low-angle shots that emphasize the height and emptiness of the new space, making the protagonist appear small and temporary within it. This visual insecurity speaks volumes about the cultural perception that success is often conditional and easily revoked, especially for those without inherited capital. In narratives involving multi-generational households, the conflict between preserving tradition and embracing modernity is frequently embodied by the elder character acting as the gatekeeper of stability. This character, often played by a seasoned performer whose face carries the topography of years of hard work, rarely raises their voice. Instead, their disapproval is communicated through their physical presence during critical family meetings. They might sit slightly apart from the younger generation, their hands folded neatly in their lap, refusing to participate in the fluid body language of the others. This rigid stillness is a powerful form of nonverbal protest, a silent declaration that the sacrifices they made demand a different path for their descendants. The subtle quiver in the elder's lip when they hear a modern colloquialism or see a progressive life choice is often the most emotionally wrenching moment in the entire drama, signaling not just disapproval, but a deep-seated fear for the family's perceived standing. These short dramas, by necessity, excel at capturing the ephemeral nature of digital age intimacy. Relationships are often forged and broken through screens, and the performance must translate that mediated experience into tangible emotion. When a long-distance virtual relationship collapses, the actor portraying the recipient of the breakup video call is forced to react to a projected image. The performance often relies on an initial lag, a beat where the actor stares blankly at the phone, not comprehending, before the realization slams into them. This moment of cognitive dissonance, where the reality shown on screen conflicts violently with the character's internal expectation, is captured in an extreme close-up that makes the skin appear almost too taut over the bone, illustrating the physical impact of purely digital emotional trauma. Tauntaun Drama Pendic, in its relentless efficiency, proves that the most profound struggles are often the ones fought entirely within the confines of personal space and mediated reality. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Sin MA channel. Please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the short film Tauntaun Drama Pendic. The screen flickers to life, immediately plunging us into a world thick with the haze of unmet ambition. We follow a young man, clearly talented, perhaps a budding musician or artist, whose initial enthusiasm is slowly being eroded by the relentless grind of trying to make a mark in a saturated creative scene. He struggles with the pressure, the familiar ache of watching others perhaps find easier success, a dynamic that echoes the early struggles of many great performers who had to cut their teeth in dimly lit, indifferent venues. His counterpart, a woman perhaps involved in the same creative ecosystem, maybe a struggling actress or a writer whose scripts gather dust, shares a similar burden of self-doubt, masked by a veneer of professional composure. Her own journey often feels like a constant negotiation between artistic integrity and the need to simply pay rent, a trade-off that chips away at the soul. One can sense the influence of classic independent cinema on her choices, a nod to those raw, honest portrayals of urban loneliness. Their paths inevitably cross, perhaps at a shared workspace or an open mic night, where the air is thick with cheap coffee and big dreams. The connection isn't immediate fireworks. It's a gradual recognition of shared weariness, a mutual understanding of the invisible lines drawn between the successful and the trying. It's in these quiet moments, sharing observations about the industry's capriciousness, that their bond deepens. As their relationship develops, it becomes the central anchor against the turbulence of their individual careers. There's a scene, highly reminiscent of that pivotal breakthrough moment in many biographical dramas, where one of them finally gets a small win, a gallery showing, a callback for a major role. But instead of pure elation, there's a strange melancholy. Success, when it arrives piecemeal, often highlights everything that hasn't quite clicked yet. This moment reveals a core tension. Can their relationship sustain the individual gravitational pulls of their careers if one begins to ascend faster than the other? The short film beautifully captures the mundane yet critical moments. Late-night arguments fueled by exhaustion, the shared triumph of finishing a difficult project, and the quiet evenings spent simply existing together, finding solace away from the demanding spotlight. One sequence where they revisit a place from their past, maybe a park bench where they first confessed their hopes, underscores the theme of grounding oneself amidst chaos. The climax isn't a grand explosion, but a subtle realignment. Perhaps one has to make a significant sacrifice, turning down a life-changing offer that requires relocation, or conversely, accepting a role that demands complete dedication, potentially putting the relationship on hold. It speaks to the inherent difficulty of sustaining intimacy when one's primary devotion must, for a time, be to the craft itself, echoing the personal costs often borne by those inspired by figures who sacrificed everything for their art. Ultimately, the narrative concludes not with a neat bow, but with a sense of earned ambiguity. They haven't conquered the industry, nor have they faded into obscurity. They have instead found a sustainable rhythm within the ongoing struggle, acknowledging that the art and the relationship is a continuous, messy project, much like the best independent films that inspire them. The final image suggests resilience, the quiet strength required to keep showing up tomorrow. The haze surrounding the young man seemed to be woven from the smoke of countless cigarettes, smoked while staring at blank pages or silent fretboards. He possessed an almost classical dedication to his chosen form, perhaps channeling the disciplined intensity one associates with early jazz innovators who practiced relentlessly in cramped basements. His frustration wasn't just about recognition, it was about authenticity, the gnawing fear that compromise would eventually dull the sharp edge of his unique voice. He often found himself scrolling through social media feeds, a modern equivalent of gazing at unattainable mansions, watching peers who seemed to stumble into success through sheer luck or better self-promotion. The woman, meanwhile, carried the weight of dramatic history on her shoulders. Her aspirations likely drew from the raw emotional landscape painted by actresses known for their unflinching portrayals of complex female lives. She had a habit, visible during tense moments, of unconsciously smoothing down imaginary wrinkles in her clothing, a small gesture of trying to impose order on internal chaos. Her rejections were not just professional setbacks, they felt like personal judgments on her very essence. One might imagine her studying the screen tests of celebrated method actors, trying to decipher the secret to truly inhabiting a role without losing oneself entirely in the process. When they finally found refuge in each other's company, it wasn't a Hollywood meeting. It was the shared silence of two marathon runners, resting side by side, recognizing the mutual burning in their legs. Their conversations were often about the why they chose this punishing path, rather than the what of their daily failures. There was a tangible sense of relief in being truly seen, away from the harsh judgment of casting directors or critics. This mutual witnessing became their unofficial studio, their sanctuary where vulnerability wasn't a liability, but the very raw material they both worked with. The small victories, when they arrived, were complicated. When the man finally secured a small but significant commission for a piece of music, perhaps for an independent short film, with a respected director whose work he admired, the elation was tempered by the knowledge that the woman was facing a crushing series of auditions for roles she felt utterly unsuited for. This imbalance created subtle friction, an unspoken question. If one of us finds solid ground, do we have to build a bridge across the chasm? Or will the current pull us in opposite directions? Their moments of tenderness often involved one actively encouraging the other, forcing them back to the drawing board or the script, reminding them of the fire they first shared. The film excels in showing the intimacy born of shared hardship. There's a beautifully shot scene where they attempt to cook a complicated meal together, a metaphor for their shared attempt to construct a life from disparate, sometimes spoiled ingredients. Mistakes are made. The sauce burns, the timing is off, but they laugh. The sound genuine and unforced. These moments suggest that their relationship isn't a distraction from their careers, but perhaps the only sustainable context in which those careers can continue. They are each other's most honest editor and most forgiving audience. The narrative's turning point often involves a choice that forces a prioritization. Perhaps the woman is offered a prestigious, yet demanding theater residency abroad. The gravity of the opportunity clashes directly with the comfortable, fragile ecosystem they have built. The discussion isn't filled with accusations, but with the quiet, heavy sound of unpacking possibilities. The potential for future regret versus the certainty of present loss. It is the adult realization that passion projects often demand an almost monastic level of commitment, one that leaves little room for shared domesticity. The final impression left by their evolving dynamic is one of acceptance, that love in this demanding environment might not look like the fairy tale ending, but rather like two artists standing together, still facing the difficult dawn, equipped only with the shared knowledge that they wouldn't rather face it with anyone else. The young man's dedication bordered on the ascetic. One could picture him having idolized those jazz legends who famously lived on cigarettes and sheer musical obsession. His instrument, whether physical or metaphorical, felt less like a tool and more like an extension of a demanding inner voice. His struggle manifested in a subtle physical tension, a slight hunch in his shoulders, as if perpetually bracing against a cold wind, a posture often adopted by those who spend too much time isolated in their own creative echo chambers. He yearned not just for success, but for the validation that would silence the internal critic who whispered that his work was derivative or, worse, irrelevant. His heroes were those composers who stubbornly refused to simplify their complexities for mass appeal, and he constantly measured his output against that impossibly high, uncompromising standard. The woman's internal landscape was as intricate as the monologues she longed to perform. Her early influences might have included actresses who famously transformed themselves for roles, suggesting she sought depth over immediate fame. She possessed a quiet intensity, a gaze that seemed to measure the sincerity of everyone she encountered. When she dressed for an audition, it wasn't vanity, it was armor, a deliberate crafting of a temporary persona designed to convince skeptical gatekeepers. Her despair wasn't loud, it was the slow seepage of hope, visible only in the moments she believed she was unobserved, perhaps staring blankly at a subway map, wondering if all roads truly led back to disappointment. Their bond thrived in the negative space around their work, in the hours between the last failed callback and the first tentative morning light. This wasn't a romance born of shared leisure, it was a shared vigil. Their connection was characterized by the language of the frustrated creative, coded references to obscure influences, the shared sigh over a poorly written industry memo, and the mutual understanding of what it felt like to pour one's soul into something that would likely be shelved without a second thought. They became each other's necessary editor, the only person whose critique they truly trusted, because they knew it stemmed from a place of shared sacrifice, not envy. The film's true emotional resonance emerged when their careers diverged slightly. Say the man's music began to be used in high-profile advertising spots, a compromise that brought financial relief, but felt artistically hollow to his core. This success became a barrier. She would watch him manage these commercial projects with a mixture of pride and sadness, recognizing that he was building a comfortable cage. Conversely, if she landed a critically acclaimed but poorly paid stage role, her exhaustion became palpable, and his financial cushion felt like an insulating layer that prevented him from truly feeling the pinch of her struggle. This subtle divergence tested the core belief that they were facing the same battle. Perhaps they were merely fighting on different fronts, requiring different forms of support. One powerful sequence involved them revisiting a rundown studio space where they had once shared a desperate, hopeful late-night session. Now, returning years later, the space seemed smaller, the past ambition almost comical, against the reality of their adult compromises. It was here they acknowledged the silent agreement they had made, that the relationship existed as a temporary scaffolding, supporting two very ambitious, very fragile structures. The emotional climax wasn't about breaking up, but about redefining what together meant when the demands of their respective crafts became absolute. It suggested that true partnership in these high-stakes creative fields required periods of intense, almost painful self-focus. The resolution, fittingly, felt like the final chord of an improvised piece, unpredictable but resolved for the moment. They didn't abandon their ambitions, nor did they settle into predictable domesticity. Instead, they carved out moments of genuine, unhurried presence, treating those shared hours with the same meticulous care they applied to their art. The final scene might show them packing for separate obligations, a tour, a film shoot,